The transitions between eras in history have long been determined by the rivalries of great empires. Athens and Sparta symbolizing the struggle between democracy and militaristic oligarchy before the Macedonians brought about the end of the classical Greek age. The long wars between the English and the French symbolizing the decline of feudal Christendom and the rise of centralized monarchical nation states. The Byzantines and Sassanids struggling over the heartland of civilization itself, a legacy of rivalry going back to Leonidas and Xerxes, before the rise of Islam would eventually bring about the end of the classical age. Today, we will open up the big book of history to the rivalry between two dynasties that serves as the bridge between medieval times and our modern era, Habsburgs versus the Ottomans. Welcome to Little Known History. This video is going to be a little bit longer than what I've made previously, so be sure to stick around if you want to see how two men, Suleiman the Magnificent and Charles V, turned their personal ambitions into one of history's longest and most defining rivalries. The Turks, who had been migrating for centuries, were a group of nomadic peoples, like the Magyars, Mughals, and Mongols, say that 10 times fast, who would often conquer sedentary peoples and adopt their religion, culture, and administrative systems. Like the Arabs before them, they embraced Islam and went on to dominate Persia in the form of the Seljuks, defeating the Buyids, as well as crippling the Byzantine Empire through the Sultanate of Rome, taking most of Anatolia. They themselves were later crippled by the Mongols, who destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258. Out of the chaos, the small Beylik of Osman I emerged. Osman is said to have dreamed of a tree growing from his navel, its branches stretching across Asia, Africa, and Europe, symbolizing the birth of the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed the Conqueror would blast down the Theodosian walls of Constantinople in 1453, renaming the city of the world's desire to Istanbul, though the name Istanbul wouldn't become common until much later, and he also turned the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. Following the Islamic rules of war, he allowed the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople to retain religious authority, and for himself he claimed the title Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome, by right of conquest. Their expansion was briefly halted by the conqueror Tamerlane, who was the founder of the Timurid Empire, before Selim I would later conquer the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517, taking the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, as well as Cairo, where the last Abbasid caliph in name was residing. The caliphate's symbolic authority passed to the Ottoman sultans, making Selim not only sultan and Caesar, but also caliph, the leader of all Sunni Muslims. While the Ottomans were consolidating the legacy of the caliphate in the east, a new power was quietly gathering strength in the mountains of Central Europe. The lands of modern Austria were once inhabited by Celtic tribes, later incorporated into the Roman Empire to secure its northern frontier against Germanic tribes. Austria became part of the Latin-speaking, papacy-following Western Roman world, which would fall in the 5th century to Germanic invasions, leaving only the Greek-speaking eastern half of the Roman Empire. A people known as the Bavarii, ancestors of modern Bavarians and Austrians, settled in the region afterward, and to this day those people speak a distinct dialect of German that other Germans can't quite understand. Medieval Christians believed in a concept called translatio imperii, the transfer of empire. You see, this was partially based on the book of Daniel, where the prophet Daniel interprets the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar of a great statue which represented successive world kingdoms in its different parts. The head of gold represented Babylon, a chest and arms of silver represented the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a belly and thigh of bronze represented the Macedonian Greek Empire, and the legs of iron with feet of iron and clay represented the Roman Empire. Just as iron is strong and breaks all things, the Roman Empire would overcome many of, if not all of its enemies. And just like how iron is strong but clay is weak, it would be partially strong and partially brittle, the western half being the brittle half and the eastern half being the strong half. Then a stone, not carved by human hands, would destroy the statue, symbolizing the eternal kingdom of heaven. Medieval Christians believed that if the legacy of Rome ever fully vanished, it would herald the end times. So the West sought to preserve that Roman essence. They got their wish when Charlemagne, the Frankish king who defended the papacy, Christianized Saxons and Avars, and sparked the Carolingian Renaissance, was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope in 800 CE. Upon the death of his son, Louis the Pious, the empire was divided among his grandsons. West Francia became France, East Francia became Germany, and Middle Francia was obviously short-lived. The German kingdom united with northern Italy, minus the Papal States, to form the Holy Roman Empire, a loose confederation of states. The title of the emperor was elected by prince-electors, and eventually the Habsburgs rose to prominence through strategic marriages rather than conquests, gaining control over the Low Countries, parts of Italy, Hungary, Bohemia, Austria, and later Spain. Two kingdoms, two worldviews, two rulers, with overlapping ambitions. Charles V, a man destined to represent all of Catholic Europe, spoke Spanish, French, German, Italian, and Dutch. He inherited vast realms through dynastic politics. From his paternal grandparents, he gained Burgundy, the Low Countries, and Austria. From his maternal grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, he gained Spain and southern Italy, as well as their overseas colonies. Charles, as Holy Roman Emperor, ruled an empire spanning Europe and the New World, even all the way to the Philippines, and it was reminiscent in scale to ancient Rome. Yet he failed to unite Europe for several reasons. First of all, the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg lines had conflicting interests, just simply due to geography. I mean, the Spanish, they had to control like one of the first overseas empires across oceans, and the Austrians, they were in the middle of Europe, right? And they had a balanced control over Italy, the Balkans, and Germany, and then, obviously they didn't end up getting any of them. Then there was Bourbon France, which was their main closest rival. If Europe was a group project, Bourbon France was like that one kid that always messes up, the kid that's doing most of the work, which is the Habsburgs, is messing up all of their progress and just sabotaging it, mainly because they're jealous. There was also influxes of silver from the Americas, which sounds good on paper, but then you remember what inflation is, and that's what happened to the economy of Spain. And then there was the Protestant Reformation, which fractured the Holy Roman Empire, forcing Charles into wars against rebellious princes. And of course, his greatest external rival, Suleiman the Magnificent, and his Ottoman Empire. Suleiman inherited his father Selim I's vast domains and continued expanding, taking Belgrade in 1521 and Rhodes in 1522, pushing into Hungary, confronting the Safavid Persians in Mesopotamia, and laying siege to Vienna in 1529. In 1526, Ottoman and Hungarian forces met at the Battle of Mohács. The Ottoman army, numbering perhaps 60,000 to 100,000, faced King Louis II's 25,000 to 30,000. The Hungarians were crushed in less than 2 hours. King Louis drowned while fleeing. This brought Suleiman and Charles into direct conflict. With Charles busy in Spain and Italy, he left his brother Ferdinand to govern Austria and Germany. Because Ferdinand was married to Louis's sister, Anne of Bohemia and Hungary, he claimed the Hungarian crown. Now, some nobles supported Ferdinand, while others backed John Zapolya, ironically enough because they wanted to be more independent, but then he immediately ran to Suleiman for support, effectively making Hungary an Ottoman vassal, and thus began a century of Habsburg-Ottoman conflict. Charles could not personally defend Vienna in 1529 since he was busy fighting the French in Italy, and so Ferdinand would command the defense. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the defenders held out thanks to fortifications, weather, and stretched out Ottoman supply lines. Heavy rain and mud hampered the Ottoman artillery, and Suleiman eventually withdrew since it wasn't worth it. The Ottomans would return to Vienna in 1683, this time under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, commanding about 150,000 troops, close to the size of the population of Jackson, Mississippi. Vienna, now modernized with bastion fortifications, held firm under Count Ernest Rudiger von Starhemberg. After months of siege, a relief army under King John III Sobieski of Poland, with 70,000 to 80,000 men, including the famous winged hussars, arrived at the most cinematic moment possible, attacking the Ottomans in one of history's largest cavalry charges, breaking the siege. The Habsburgs gained most of Hungary through the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. Meanwhile, at sea, Charles's forces lost to Ottoman Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa at the Battle of Preveza in 1538, giving the Ottomans dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. Now, decades later, in 1571, the Ottomans captured Cyprus from Venice, and so Pope Pius V formed the Holy League: Spain, Venice, Papal States, and other smaller Italian states, leading to the Battle of Lepanto. Basically, if you were Catholic and you owned a boat, you were on the team. Now, Don Juan of Austria, Charles's illegitimate son, commanded the Christian fleets, and Muezzin-Zadeh Ali Pasha led the Ottomans. The Christians won decisively, halting Ottoman naval supremacy in the western Mediterranean, though the Ottomans rebuilt much of their fleet within a year. The Ottomans, Austrians, and even Spanish, even after they came under the rule of the Bourbons instead of the Habsburgs, were all heirs to Rome's fragmented legacy. The Habsburgs through Translato Imperii, the Ottomans through right of conquest, the Spanish through their claim to universal Christendom after the Reconquista. The Catholics expelled the Moors from Spain in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west. Now, viewed through the lens of death and rebirth, the Habsburgs might have united Europe, but constant wars drained them. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 shattered the Holy Roman Empire. Rivalry with France cost them dominance in Italy. The War of the Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714, after Charles II of Spain died childless, put a Bourbon on the Spanish throne. The War of the Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748 would end up strengthening Prussia in the long term under Frederick the Great. Their neutrality in the Crimean War alienated Russia and weakened their influence in the Balkans. And the Portuguese Restoration in 1640, which coincided with the Dutch Revolt and from 1568 to 1648, cost them both Portugal and the Netherlands. So this just goes to show that no matter what the Austrian Habsburgs did, they just kept losing. Like, if losing wars was a sport, they would have a dynasty and not too, right? Because think, like, when they didn't get involved in the war in Russia, they still lost influence in the Balkans. So they still lost even when they didn't get involved. When they won the war against Prussia, when they won the War of Austrian Succession, this would only strengthen Prussia, which would later go on to unite Germany without them. And then, worst of all, the Dutch Revolt, right? The reason why it's worst of all is because the Spanish elites made the horrible decision of not defending Portugal's colonies, which prevented them from having a united Iberian Union, and not just that, having like a united Iberian Empire. Can you imagine if they had that though? Because if they did, like, they would literally never lose a World Cup. But I digress. The Ottomans likewise declined. Their vast empire was costly to defend. They fought repeated wars with Persia, lost control over semi-independent provinces like Egypt under Muhammad Ali Pasha after Napoleon's invasion in 1798, and faced revolts from Arabia to the Balkans. By the 19th century, the empire was called the sick man of Europe. Both the Habsburg and Ottoman empires finally collapsed after fighting side by side in World War I. The war to end all wars, or at least the war to end the pre-modern age, I guess you could say. If you want to say that the modern age started at the end of World War I, a lot of people would say it started at the end of World War II. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed researching it. If you learned anything new at all, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. This is Little Known History, signing out.